Would corporations exist in a stateless society? Hey, I'm Mike. Thanks for joining us here at Voluntary Order. And yeah, let's talk about corporations. Would they exist in a stateless free market society? I'm Mike. So glad to have you guys today here on Voluntary Order. If you haven't joined our Facebook page, go over to Voluntary Order here on Facebook and make sure you follow that. Then also head over to our YouTube channel, which is Voluntary Order. We got like 6,400 something subscribers and growing. Thanks to all the people commenting over there, watching the videos. The more watch time we get, the more people see, the more people learn of these concepts and ideas. So we want to talk tonight about corporations. Would they exist in a stateless society? Because in all reality, large businesses, complex commercial organizations and structures could still exist inside of a free market, a truly stateless society. We're talking about anarcho-capitalism, voluntarism type society here. There's nothing inherently, I got a list of notes here we're going to be running through, but there's nothing inherently statist about people voluntarily pooling resources together, right? So a couple things I had listed here: capital and labor and infrastructure and contracts and insurance and investment. Those can all be voluntary. They're not necessarily coercive. And so we need to be realistic and, I think cognizant of the fact that these things can exist without a state. And to me, property is the real anti-slavery. Without property rights, you just have kind of the law of the jungle. Anybody can steal from anybody else. There's nothing saying that people can't just walk up and take your stuff. That's obviously not a very productive society. Not what we need to go towards. The ability for you to own and to control and to be able to trade and defend what's yours. This voluntary exchange of property, it allows individuals to remain independent from control over others, especially from the central monopoly of the state. So that's why I say property is the real anti-slavery. Without property rights, people would become dependent on political permission. They'd have to, all allocation would have to be centralized. It'd have to go through some kind of a centralized network. There'd have to be authority and ruling classes assigned to do that structure, right? And so there's conflicts. Somebody's going to win out at the end of the day. It's easier just to let the market people naturally go about their days and collecting their own property. I'm not saying it's a perfect society, but it's better than anything else that's out there, any other option. But a corporation in a broad sense is simply an organizational structure, right? Like imagine I create a soccer league or something like that. We'll just talk Little League, so it's just maybe at the school. That doesn't necessarily require a state to have any of that, right? Me and my friend, let's say we're doing instead of doing a proprietorship, I want to do a partnership business. I can just go into business with them. That doesn't require a state. So what stops me from doing 3 or 5 people pooling resources together and then eventually selling shares of the company for any potential income on that? You don't require a state for that, right? So I think it's important to realize that this corporations could be a voluntary association. It's going to be completely different than what we have today, though. So a lot of people see that we have corporations today, and they just assume that that's capitalism, and I disagree with that analysis 100%. So capitalism, let's define that real quick, is simply a society of private individuals having the right to not be enslaved and to having their own property and being able to own and control it. I own my house. I own my business. I own whatever I homestead. So if there's unused resources and I'm going to go use that, and I'm not saying it's a perfect definition of this, right? But at some point, if you don't allow people to have control, and ownership is just control, controls ownership. Finkel's Einhorn, Einhorn's Finkel, right? For those who are the Jim Carrey fans. My point here is that without that, you are just naturally enslaved to somebody else, and you don't have your freedom. You're not going to be free. Me being able to have my own property. Now, that also could come down to renting it. So I don't have to necessarily fully own the resource in theory. If I rent with somebody else, there's a contract that says I can control these resources. Of course, usually there's stipulations in there as well. But that's my choice if I want to rent versus own. Currently, I'm in this house that I'm in right here. I have other properties too, but this one here I'm renting. That doesn't mean I'm not free. Right, I get to choose what I do here. I could go buy another house. So anyway, I think it's important also. The real question is not could large firms exist in the state, right? I think the real question that we need to focus on tonight is could firms obtain coercive privilege without a centralized state, without statism. Because in a stateless society, businesses could not rely on taxation or extortion. They couldn't rely on state bailouts, right? Taking money from one group to give money to these people to, too big to fail. You wouldn't have regulatory protection. So a lot of the regulatory capture that we have in our system today would not exist in a true stateless free market. So once again, too big to fail would be completely out the wazoo, right? You wouldn't be able to have corporations creating regulations that they know blocks out small competitors, which helps drive up costs on consumers. It hurts the poor people, right? You wouldn't have this tariff protectionism from big government, right? Which is just taxation on local domestic businesses. That's all it is, right? Anybody who knows, who looks through the smoke and mirrors and crap, the propaganda, tariffs are just another tax that's local. It's funny because back in the day, the big government people used to be all about tariffs. And of course, because one idiot started thinking one way. Anyway, central banking privilege would go out the wazoo. You wouldn't have any central banks in a stateless free society, right? So the whole illusion of the state would be gone. Any of those state enforced monopolies would be gone too. USPS would be gone. Other people could use mailboxes for people's houses. Right? So many things. There's so many different types of state enforced monopolies out there. Any kind of tax advantages, like politically advantaged, tax structures out there that hurt one group and help another. Those would be gone. Government contracts that are funded through coercion, they'd be completely gone. Any state barriers to entry, those would be gone as well. Zoning monopolies, oh man, that's a big one, especially in housing sectors, right? You wouldn't have these cartels around occupational licensing. That would be completely void in a truly free society as well. So once again, because there's no state, there's no inflationary monetary privilege as well. So that Cantillon effect in which the people who are most politically connected get the easy credit first, and then it supposedly from the state trickles down. It's funny because people act like trickle down theory is free markets. It's not. It's actually statism's failed attempt to be free market. But the legal immunity, right? We're talking about sovereign immunity, qualified immunity, those through political influence, that would be all gone too. And then any type of subsidized risk that's transferred onto taxpayers constantly nonstop, right? Think of agricultural subsidies and other things that have these negative externalities. All of those mechanisms require political monopoly to be capable, and that's through coercion. So without the state, these corporations would look completely different than what we have today, and the mechanism of what we have today would pretty much completely disappear entirely. So large firms could still emerge through things like consumer preference and reputation, branding. I think it's a perfect one. Contractual trust, efficiency too. So like if a group of people, a corporation, do something really, really well, they're going to attract more people wanting to do business with them because they do it really, really well. Innovation is another way that they could advance any group of people who are doing a thing and doing it very well. So the only way you could kind of build a moat around yourself is to continually be innovative and try to be better than the rest of everybody else. Investment performance, that's obviously where you're delivering the highest return to the people who are investing in you. You wouldn't have quite the same type of performance that you would have out of states that have, or today's corporations that have state benefit, right? Those obviously are going to edge out when you can suppress competition. The market would be much more difficult for the rich. They'd have to compete harder for our dollars, and it would actually benefit the poor by driving up consumer surplus. Voluntary cooperation, and then things like competitive pricing. So any type of pricing model out there wouldn't be protected, right? So there would be no subsidies, which makes it so they can try to offer these things at higher marginal values from a profit perspective. So all of this would completely change. These companies could only survive through providing real value, through providing consumer surplus, and hopefully creating producer surplus in the shorter realm. Also, we want everybody to win here. But it's the competitiveness that's stolen by the state of the larger corporations that we have today, which leads, the S&P 500 to recently being, most of the gains being from just a few handful of companies. Those companies would have a lot more competition in a true free market, right? Which actually be better for everybody, not just domestically, but globally. So you also notice that, other communist and socialist regions throughout the world, they actually don't have any investment because they've killed off all competition. At least here we have some ability to have that competition in some markets. Some places have no markets at all. North Korea, right? Venezuela, very limited on, a lot of state-owned businesses. Cuba, there's sadly, plenty of other areas we could look at for that too. So it's important, we could still have large-scale manufacturing. We'd still have shipping networks. We'd have insurance associations. We'd have investment consortiums. We'd have huge multinational trade organizations and private infrastructure firms, right? So you're still going to have roads. It's one of the things. Well, how are you going to have roads? Companies are not going to try and find ways to make it profitable to get to their point of business to do business. It's absolutely silly, right? And probably at a much cheaper efficiency than what we have today with the state running everything in its monopoly. Still have rail systems. You'd have energy providers, aerospace firms, SpaceX. Look at NASA. It's fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, fortunate for us from a market perspective that, they just weren't efficient enough to really survive, and private manufacturers are going to take us into space. And I hope soon, because I think that's like the final frontier, not to get cliche here, but that's kind of the end. You're like, at some point you'll be able to outrun the state. Right now we're all trapped to the globe, so politicians have us locked down by gravity here. So some industries naturally favor larger organizational structures because they are capital intense, right? They have logistics and infrastructure demands, and they have extreme complexity around coordination. So you're going to have these industries naturally forming corporations or people coming together to pool resources, because you're not going to have a mom and pop shop be able to do energy company. That doesn't mean that it has to be a state monopoly. But without a state, even the large firms will remain exposed to that competition. Right? The goal here, and you're going to see a theme that I keep bringing up here, is the right to exit. So without the right to exit, people are stuck. That's what actually enslaves us, right, to the politicians and everything else, is us lacking the right in the state. We don't have the right to exit out of something we disagree with, right? We are forced into that monopoly or oligopoly. In the case of like the Republicans and Democrats, we're in America here, we're stuck to that oligopoly, which is all a monopoly from the state, right? So the monopoly of the state forces these two political parties which enslave us, and we're kind of stuck. There's just not enough smart people to kind of see about freedom and understanding, economics and all the rest of this, anthropology, etc. So, but without a state, those large firms would be exposed to competition, which is what we want. So no centralized institution would exist with the authority to suppress competitors. So it's actually very disadvantageous in a true market. There's so many different people that could pop up to try to compete against you that without the state going around hammering the small guys or other competitors that try to pop up, the whack-a-mole thing, it would be whack-a-mole. Because you'd have a group of capital over here that'd be defeated, right? And so this company, the companies out there that are trying to survive, it's just too labor intensive to go around trying to smash all the competitors without a state. They'd have to focus on providing the best resources, and because people can exit, they could go to a company that's providing better resources and better value, right, for whatever that thing that they're trying to supply in the market is. So under statism, this economic power often becomes intertwined with political power. People will say we got to get money out of politics, right? But the funny thing is, it's just the opposite. We need to get the state and its violent monopoly out of money. We got to get the politics out of the market. We got to get the control freaks outside of our individual property rights and our right to control ourselves and our bodies. That's what we need to do. People see, and that's how the system continues. It continues by alluding to people that, oh yeah, we got to keep the system and money's bad, right? Where it's the opposite way. Like money popped around, came about medium exchange, if we're going to go back this far, not just to paper currencies or fiat, but medium exchange came about because people were becoming freer and they had the right to trade resources, and they needed to identify. It sends market price information to us so that we know exactly what we need to do and where things need to flow And that supply and demand, that equilibrium or that harmonization point of that supply and demand helps guide the market and everybody in it, right? So it's also important to realize that businesses could still accumulate wealth, but they could not convert that wealth into legalized coercive privilege to the state. So you wouldn't have regulations from the state that make it so that they could have regulatory capture and enslave all the whole market and then act like it's a free market when it's really not, right? That's what's really screwing us today. You wouldn't have this legislative branch that they could just enslave and have all the special interests running that monopoly. There would be no right to steal in the mind of anybody. Taxation would be gone. And so without the right to steal, that foolish mentality that you have the right to take from other human beings, they would not have, nobody would actually look at anybody who's stealing and be like, oh, that's justified because they had this, popularity contest and they got 51% of the vote. Yay. So they can go around beating people up and stealing and throwing them in cages now. You wouldn't have any of the licensing also that helps with the regulatory capture. You could still have certifications and things like ISO compliance. And firms would want to get those to show people, hey, we are providing value. We went out into the market. There's this very hard litmus test that we had to pass through a quality inspections QA/QC to get through this, right? There would be no state violence that tries to justify their monopolization and the regulatory capture and them being able to dominate entire industries. You can look back to, people will bring up East India Company and stuff like that. That was all empowered by the state. All of this was empowered by the state. So every time you look back at some big corporation throughout history, it's always in statism, right? When you go back to things like Lex Mercatoria, where you had in Europe for hundreds of years, and even in Iceland, they had as close as you could get to stateless societies, and the corporations they were very competitive. They couldn't just go around beating everybody else up and stealing their money. It wasn't profitable to do that anyway. You need states for the big corporations to enslave us. So, because no political apparatus would exist to grant those privileges, they wouldn't be there, right? We live in a statist society, and so there's a monopoly gun. So of course, every business and every person's going to have to run to grab the state gun because we don't have free market, justice systems. So because there's a monopoly that exists through the state, and everybody's brainwashed into this belief that this violent monopoly is the only way to run a society, you're going to have people trying to control the gun, and you have to go after the gun to benefit you, or else it's going to be pointed at you. See, we need to take the gun out of the scenario. We can still have guns for defense, etc. But of the violent monopoly where everybody has to fight over it and then there's one winner and they can point guns at everybody else, that's not good. I can't believe people in the future when they don't, like someday they might actually have stateless societies. They're going to look back on these videos and be like, what the hell? They'll look at mainstream war today and it'll almost shock and awe because it'll be gone in the year 1 million or whatever. So that means that firms would generally be very more accountable to consumers. They'd have to be. They'd be more vulnerable to competition, vulnerable to failure, right? So whereas today, too big to fail, even if you suck, we're going to bail you out, right? Which, of course, just enslaves most of the rest of the people. It's concentrated benefit and dispersed cost, right? That's the way that the state works. So they'd be less insulated from some of these bad decisions that they make and that ripple throughout the economy today. They'd be unable to socialize a lot of these losses, right? To just charge the bill to unborn grandchildren, people who have never consented to any of this stuff, and some of them aren't even born yet. They'll be stuck to higher tax rates in the future. Won't be able to enslave those people. They'd be unable to suppress competitors politically. They'd be unable to externalize these costs through lobbying and special interests. That would all be gone. In stateless markets, you wouldn't have any of this nonsense that we have today. In true, real capitalism, where every single individual is empowered and no state monopoly exists, you wouldn't have a lot of these same incentives that wreck and that corrupt today. So, but I'm not saying a stateless society is perfect, right? It's not going to guarantee perfect outcomes or equal outcomes, to be fair, even. There is no perfect ethical system out there. So I'm not trying to make it sound perfectly rosy. I don't want to sell it that way. You're going to have problems, but they're just not going to be the same problems. It's going to be way better. So yeah, I think what we need to next turn to is, what it removes is the institutional machinery that allows the wealthy today to take over the coercive political power. If we could summarize that up in there. Because remember, property is the real anti-slavery. And when you allow the bigger corporations today within a state to go in and grab that gun, they will turn around and infringe on people's property, which enslaves us. So without property, we are enslaved. Without capitalism, we are enslaved. Without your individual right, it is pro-slavery. The state is pro-slavery. So property rights decentralize power. The state centralizes power. Capitalism decentralizes power. And I know people say, well, we can have the workers own the means of production, right? That's still capitalism, right? Because you're letting a group of workers here own their thing. If they want to pool resources together, they're a corporation too. That's the funniest thing, right? So even anarcho-syndicalism at some level is just another form of anarcho-capitalism, as long as it doesn't use state powers to infringe and it respects other people's property. Property rights allow individuals and voluntary groups to say no, to exit abusive systems. Once again, exit. If I cannot stress one more thing in this video, it's that corporations and statism do not allow exit for people who disagree with them, whereas in corporations in a free market, exit would be more abundant from these abusive systems. People could leave. People could choose alternatives. So this, once again, enables more competitive innovation, and people could survive without permission from rulers, right? If we could summarize it any other way. So it's really, I don't want to necessarily make it a big distinction around big business versus small business. Of course, in statism, big business will be able to grab the gun easier and block out smaller competitors. That's clearly a true thing, right? I think things like the Russell 2000 and small businesses, that index would probably have much higher returns than potentially the S&P 500 every year, right? And have it maybe potentially be flipped so that smaller businesses thrive. You'll notice that the more economic freedom a region gets, the more small businesses thrive, and the ones that the big businesses have more competition. This is a historical accuracy. So this is just a pure, point of fact of the world. The real distinction here isn't necessarily, big corporation versus small corporation or big businesses versus small business. It is voluntary exchange versus coercive privilege. Voluntary exchange, voluntary freedom versus coercive privilege, coercive control. That's the real dichotomy. That's it. Property stops the coercive privilege and enables the voluntary exchange. So there's some rebuttals here that I wanted to go through that I hear often, and I just wanted to make a couple points on those. People will say, without a state, corporations would just become private governments, right? If you don't have a state, a new state will be made. Well, first of all, there's a couple layers here. Let's peel this onion back. If we have that problem, you've already admitted that the real fear is that they will create a state. You're admitting to what I'm saying already, which is that the state's the problem and that you're afraid a new state will be created. You don't fix that by empowering states. So even if that is a concern, the last thing you want to do is empower a state. It just makes no sense. Governments possess legalized monopoly power. They can tax without consent. They can impose laws unilaterally, and they criminalize competitors. They also claim territorial monopoly authority. So businesses in a stateless market could not do those things legitimately. If a firm that relies on voluntary customers and contracts, they are fundamentally different from a compulsive state that justifies jurisdiction over unwilling people. Should be pretty straightforward, right? Another thing I hear often is that large corporations would just hire private armies, right? Well, once again, kind of alludes back to that first argument. Well, you're saying the state currently maintains the largest armies in human history. So if you're afraid of large armies, you definitely don't want states, right? And if you're always saying that the government is taken over by private businesses, none of that makes any sense. It doesn't lead to that same conclusion. People never think this through all the way. So the concern is really about concentrated coercive power, right? So like people who just support freedom and anarcho-capitalists, et cetera, they argue that the state is the largest example of that. It's not a solution to it. So without taxation and without that legal monopoly protection, maintaining, sustaining these large-scale troops and militaries would be extremely expensive and drastically harder to do. It's just not realistic. It's just not realistic. So private firms would face market retaliation from people and others in the markets. They would have insurance consequences too. Insurance firms are going to exist out there, and they don't want to take on any type of risk with things that could become a military and start infringing on others. That's not good for business. There'd be defensive coalitions between communities too. So anytime that something popped up and some coercive agent or firm or institution came about, you'd have everybody and their great grandma fighting against them. It would also hurt their reputation, not just from a firm perspective, but the individuals in that are trying to do it. People would see that pierce the veil, whereas the state, you can get away with it because it's, this country or that country that's doing it. Really, it's the people in it. But that veil would be pierced. People would be like, we know it's John Smith. That asshole and his family are criminals. Let's put him down in history as such. They'd also be economically isolated, right? And then you would have other competing security agencies that would be able to fight against them, right? So another thing that we hear all the time is that the rich would just dominate everyone, right? Which, of course, if you heard anything I've said in the last little while here, you would realize that's just not plausible. But let's go into why. Wealth and coercive authority are not the same thing. People like to say, oh, blame the rich. But you can have a good rich person and a bad poor person. You can have a bad rich person and a good poor person, right? Just because you're rich or just because you're poor doesn't mean you're good or bad, right? It's what your actions are, what you do, whether you infringe on other people's bodies and property. Under statism, wealth can be converted into political privilege, right? In a free society, though, in stateless free markets, wealth alone does not automatically create legal authority over others. That's not something, that's the whole point of what a free market is. It's saying we negate that. We have an educated populace that would go against that. And if you don't have an educated populace, none of this matters anyway. That's why we have statism today. Because most people are dumb. They go to these state schools. They're not going to teach you this kind of stuff, right? That would be economic suicide to the politicians. So wealth alone does not automatically create legal authority over others. Rich people can offer incentives, right? But they cannot legally compel obedience through a monopoly legal system like under the state. So once again, it all comes back to the state being the problem. At the end of the day, they have to turn to the state to get their control. Another rebuttal I hear from anti-market, anti-capitalists is that monopolies would just take over, right? But really what happens is the most durable monopolies in history have always relied on state licensing, subsidies and tariff protectionism, patents through intellectual property and regulatory capture, various forms of regulatory capture. And they've also gotten that, what we talked about, the Cantillon effect earlier, like the central bank, they want to go out and put money into the economy, right, to stimulate the economy. They get that central banking privilege first. They're the first ones to get that money. So those monopolies have always been connected to the state. And they get government protection from competition. But in an open market, an open competition, these monopolies are going to have difficulty maintaining their high profits. And anytime they do have high profits, it's actually going to attract competitors too. So that's another part of this economic thing you got to point out as well. Whereas today, the state can block out that competition. You wouldn't have that in a truly free market. So without state barriers to entry, these dominant firms would remain very vulnerable, right? That's why they want the state, right? So, and that's why we have to fight against the state, because it empowers them and hurts the poor, and hurts the consumers, and benefits the few that are politically connected. Another thing that I hear all the time is that workers would be exploited, right? But you'll find in regions that have the most economic freedom, their workers today have the highest standard of living. And in the regions that have economic controls where the government owns business, those people suffer the most. They have the most shortages. They have the most poverty, abject poverty, not just poverty like in the U.S., where you can still have a cell phone and drive a beat-up car. We're talking about like you're eating mud and boiling bark and leaves to try to get some nutrients. This is not a joke. Real people getting hurt because they don't have freedom. So exploitation also implies coercion, right? A voluntary labor agreement is fundamentally different from forced labor. And especially when you have freer markets and you're going to have all these competitors popping up everywhere, they're going to try and offer people, come to me, come work for me. They want to lure workers away from their 15 million competitors. Whereas today, you've got Pepsi and Coke, right? There's just two companies making the soda. Now, of course, we have more than that, thankfully. But they don't. We have a couple bigger companies because they get that form of protectionism. Of course, man, can you imagine what the S&P 500 would look like? It would be pretty hard for these companies to readjust and rebalance. As Coca-Cola might go out of business in 20 years because they don't have protectionism anymore. It would make the index funds a little bit more chaotic in a good way. So once again, because the rich couldn't just enslave us all. But no, people seem to always want states because they buy this illusion, this delusional perspective that it protects the workers. No, it's quite opposite of that. Freer societies increase exit options and competition and allow better bargaining alternatives and arrangements. So this is not an ahistorical perspective. It is a very historical, use case based, backed idea. Another thing I hear all the time is that poor people would have no protection, right? But it's funny because through some of the worst forms of poverty and war and famine that we've seen in history, abuse, corruption, and mass incarcerations and censorship, etc., that has been alongside states. And the more freedom you get your Bill of Rights, you get the freedom of speech, you get First Amendments, you get the right to bear arms, you get the right to not self-incriminate. These things, these freedoms, are what stops the abuse, stops the corruption, stops the mass incarceration, stops the political corruption. Those free societies are what pushes away the poverty and has less abject poverty. The countries with more economic freedom, if you ever look at the chart, it's that regression analysis score, look at R squared. The lower you are in freedom, the more abject poverty you have, and the more freedom your society has, the more people are lifted out of it, right? I'm not saying there's no such thing as a perfect world. It's a better existence when you have more freedom, when you have more property rights. So this whole idea that the poor people would have no protection, quite the opposite. What we see historically, factually, empirically, is that the poor people have better protection when they are freer and have choice and have, once again, the right to exit, right to compete, right to choose, right to have better arrangements, right to bargain. So the existence of a state does not eliminate suffering. It compounds it. So people like me, freedom people, we argue that decentralized systems create more adaptive and competitive forms of things like charity and mutual aid and dispute resolution and arbitration and mediation and insurance and overall community support in general. Right. Look at responses today. You'll find that the immediate responses after major disasters like hurricanes. I know because I was in a hurricane recently, a couple years ago in North Carolina, and the people on the front lines did a way better job than FEMA did. Governments were very slow to respond. Of course, they wanted to deem control over everything. What's new? But anyway, let's move on. Another rebuttal that I hear all the time is that property rights are just violence, right? They enslave people. But all social systems require some method of determining control over these scarce resources, right? We live in a scarce world. We don't have unlimited anything in the world. We might have abundance because we've had markets be able to bring more abundance. So it seems like it's post-scarcity, but you always have some form of scarcity. The real question is centralized coercive allocation versus decentralized voluntary ownership, right? Can you and I own our own houses? Can we own our own businesses and maybe fail? Maybe I go out of business because I ran my business crappily. Maybe I make a lot of money because I did a really good job, right? When it's central controlled, one bad failure affects everyone. The ripple effect is dramatic and extremely harmful. Entire societies can fall. It's really bad. So property rights reduce conflict by establishing these predictable boundaries around resource usage. That's all it does. That's why it's a much more stable form of a society. Without property rights, disputes over resources, they don't disappear. They actually increase conflict. So you actually get more struggles without having some form of property and allowing people to be able to control their own resources and sell and buy as they see fit. Some people will argue, this is just going to bring about feudalism, right? I'm sure you've heard that before. But feudalism, if you have any historical preference, was extremely political and hierarchical. It relied on things like legal caste systems that were enforced by states, state territorial rulers, state political privilege, state compulsory obligations, monopolized force, all around state. They took away people's property rights. Feudalism is the opposite of a proprietarian society. So voluntary market lacks any of those kind of defining features. The existence of wealth differences alone does not equal feudalism. So just because you have wealth and people are different doesn't mean all of the other things that the state brought that were negative exist. And then another big one is, without regulation, companies would just poison people and destroy the environment. First of all, you have an incentive for your brand as a company to not poison and harm other people, right? You're gonna be liable if you hurt other people and kill them. People will look at you as an evil company. They will boycott you. They will try to sue you in some private arbitration court. And the other thing is, with property rights, we've always found that with property, once people can take over these conservatories and they can control things like wetlands and stuff like that, the government, it's very political. So, for maybe 20 years, we were able to, as Democrats, hold this, resource good. And then some evil Trump gets in there, will say, let's just go along with me on this one. And he cuts all this funding for that. And now the wetlands are open up to the top corporations that have bought out the state. Very bad long run plan. That's not how you do conservatorship and protecting the environment. I have entire videos that go to Voluntary Order on the YouTube channel. Check out some of my environmental videos. Very powerful. And they address the root problem here with these state-controlled forms of environmental protections and how they fail and why these systems are set up to fail and why you should expect them to not work. It's pretty much basic logic once you understand things at this type of level. But governments themselves have always historically been among the largest polluters and destroyers through things like war. It's one of the biggest ones. Eminent domain. And then they also subsidize a lot of industrial policy. They give these tax carbon credits. So they purposely allow people that are politically connected to have pollution, and then they'll go hunt down the other ones and say, oh, you can't use straws while we drop, megaton bombs on people and that wreck the environment. So in a stateless framework, pollution becomes a property rights violation issue. If you go off and pollute my property or somebody else's, you're going to be seen as the evil one, and the society around us is going to demand that you have some type of restitution. And it could put you into a position, if you're going around harming other people and polluting other people's property, you could starve to death, no joke, if you don't fix your ways. Whereas in the state, they protect you. They just buy some carbon credits. You'll be okay. So if a company damages another person's body or property, that constitutes aggression and liability in a free market, in a capitalist society. So the argument is not that harm becomes acceptable. It's that centralized bureaucratic immunity is completely removed from the scenario in a free society. You don't have that privilege of the state in its corporatocracy, in its state corporatocracy version. So we've talked about this for a while here. Bringing it all together, the state itself is the root of the problem, not people pulling resources together. And if your fear is that having corporations and having businesses and having people running things and competing in a market economy is going to bring about more states, you're only admitting that the state is the problem, right? And we already discussed how workers' co-ops could still exist. You just have to go produce a product better. If you're so much better than some business owner, go prove it. Go compete against them and kick their ass in a free market. You'd have that ability. The richest people in the world today wouldn't have any of those advantages of the state. So, and you'd still have the ability for shares and stocks and bonds and all the rest of this. You'd still have currency and medium of exchange. Medium of exchange isn't going anywhere. Even the most communist countries in the world still use money because they have to. Without that, you have no information throughout your economy whatsoever. So I'm hoping that people realize that, and I'm trying to see if I can read the comments in here real quick, that the state itself is the root problem. It's not a problem with people pooling resources. And that, if anything, we need to get government out of markets, not money out of government. That's not, people see it all backwards. So I am going to read through some of these questions here. Good question. First, roads, hardest and national defense. So national defense, we were talking more about corporations today. I think I'm on the wrong one. Here we go. Let me go to a different one. Sorry, there's lots of stuff going on. One of the things Front Porch Anarchist says, I had a guy tell me recently that all property claims are violence. Of course, he was unable to defend that belief. He said to do so was boring. Trevor Phillips says, a level playing field creates environment that enables growth. Rules of any sort limit that growth potential. The practice is statism invented corporations. And there's a little bit of truth to that. So I think the state has this thing where people think that you can't have any type of pooling of resources without the state. I would negate that thought because, this is Eddie Ferdovich, excuse me. The state definitely tries to make it look that way, to make it look like it's a necessary entity, but you're still going to have people pool resources and want to work together to own companies and stuff like that. So another thing Eddie says here is, I don't think we will have corporations. There would be no need for them. The only reason we have corporations is for taxes, comply with regulations, but the practice of statism. So, it comes back, I think the point here is, how do we define corporation, right? If it's just a thing that the government deems because they gave you that license of authenticity to say you're this company or LLC or whatever, or S Corp, that would be different, right? In that specific viewpoint, I would agree. Going back to my point, though, you can still pool resources. You could still issue shares and stock in a free market without that. So you would just lose a lot of the state benefits and privileges, the bad ones that hurt consumers and that benefit the few up top, and put more pressure on the rich without that. So I don't want people to think that you can't pool resources in a free market. You wouldn't have property rights without a government. If anything, a property infringing property protector is a contradiction in terms. To say that the state, which infringes on property, is needed to protect property, it's a self-refuting comment. Oh, the irony of the world that we live in today. All right, I think that's all for today. I appreciate you all stopping in, and I'm going to drop this over on YouTube. So yeah, once again, join us over on Voluntary Order, both on Facebook, TikTok, X, and YouTube. YouTube, we've got like 6,400 plus subscribers. We keep growing. I think we've gone up about 100 in the last month. So tell your friends, don't hide your kids, don't hide your wife, get them out there, get them involved. We are not about political parties, although I don't care if you vote. My thing here is, we talked about this in the past too. Ideas are what change the world, not some kind of thing in a ballot box. That's not going to do much to me. Feel free to go vote Libertarian or whatever you want. I don't care. I want you to spread the ideals that we're discussing today. If everybody understood that, the rest of the world would take care of itself, right? So we need to make an educated populace. And you could say, well, it's too hard to do that. Well, that's our only option. We need to educate, and we need to inform, and we need to spread this knowledge to as many people as possible. So that's your homework for the day. And I hope to see you on our Facebook page. Thank you so much. The more you can comment, the more watch time you can give to the videos would help. That tremendously drives us up in the algorithm. So keep helping us grow. We've got 151,000 followers on our Facebook page. And, like I said, over 6,400 over on YouTube. So thanks so much, everyone. And I'm sure we will talk soon. Have a great week. Bye, all.